Don't play with it, don't be dishonest. Ay, still not understanding.
Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are doing the theories of evolution. We did an introduction already. If you haven't watched that video, I suggest that you pause, go through that video, because you're gonna need the concepts that were discussed there to understand the three theories of evolution that we're about to look at. That is Lamarckism, Darwinism, as well as punctuated equilibrium. So let's get into it. This is a screenshot from the examination guidelines, which will help us to know what we need to focus on. So we're going to start with Lamarckism. So Lamarckism is a theory by Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, who was born in 1744 and died in 1829. So he uses the law of use and disuse, as well as the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics, to explain evolution. So with the law of use and disuse, we look at these two terms, use as well as disuse. This has to do with structures that organisms have. So the organism can either use the structure, or they speak about structures that are not being used. So the idea behind this law is that structures that are being used, they become bigger, and structures that are not used, they become smaller and probably eventually disappear. A common example that is being used across multiple textbooks is the neck of a giraffe. We know that giraffes have a long neck. So in understanding this law, you can simply say that the neck of a giraffe was short initially, and then because it's constantly being used to reach trees or the top of the trees, so the giraffe is stretching their neck, and as a result it becomes longer or long. And that is use and disuse. Now, with the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics, on the other hand, we look at the terms inheritance as well as acquired. Inheritance simply means that it's passed on from parent to offspring, while acquired characteristics, these are developed over time or from being used or disused. So we can simply say that parents pass on the characteristic that was acquired to their offspring. In this case of the example, we talk about the long neck. So they pass on long necks to the offspring. Now, from the exam guidelines, we learned that Lamarck's theory was rejected because, firstly, there's no supporting evidence to show the how. How is the long neck being passed on to the offspring? So for exam purposes, you should be able to explain why Lamarck's theory was rejected. We say there is no supporting evidence on how traits are passed on to the offspring. But remember that although it was rejected, it did benchmark the study of evolution by Charles. Now let's look at Darwinism by Charles Darwin. So his theory is a theory of evolution by natural selection. So there's a few information here written from the examination guideline, but before we delve into that, the theory of natural selection is based on Charles Darwin's observations as well as conclusions. So Darwin made 4 observations. The first one is that populations produce more offspring than they need to. Secondly, that sizes and population resources remain constant. This simply means that they're just limited resources in a habitat. Thirdly, that there is a great deal of variation among organisms of the same species. We did look at meiosis, random fertilization, random mating, etc. in the previous video. And lastly, he made an observation that some characteristics are passed on from parent to offspring. And the key term is that this is over generations. Now, he concluded in the following ways that the best suited individuals are the ones that survive, then they reproduce and pass on this best suited characteristic or useful characteristic to their offspring. This then allows for the overall genetic composition of a population to change over time, over a generation. This is made possible by the reproduction of organisms that are different. Now, we should be able to use these observations and conclusions to describe evolution by natural selection. Here, we have a nice description from the exam guidelines, which states that there is a great deal of variation among the offspring. Some will have favorable characteristics and some do not. And when there's a change in environmental condition or if there is competition, organisms with favorable characteristics, they are able to survive, while those with unfavorable characteristics are less suited and they die. Then the organisms that survive, they reproduce and pass on the allele for favorable characteristic to their offspring. The next generation will therefore have a higher proportion of individuals with favorable characteristics. I was just highlighting the key important parts that you need when you answer questions about the theory of natural selection. So we can do the same and look at the neck of a giraffe. Darwin talks about variation among giraffes. So that's the first point. We must also mention that variation, some have long necks and some have short necks. Now, environmental conditions can change or could be competition. In this case, I think it makes better sense to look at it at a competition point of view. They compete for food. The leaves are at the top of the tree. So it simply means that those with long necks are better suited for survival and those with short necks are less suited for survival. Which brings us to number 4. Those with short necks are going to die because of no food, or they're unable to reach the leaves at the top of the tree, and therefore they die. And those with long necks, they have the food and they survive. So the favorable characteristic is the long neck. They're able to survive and therefore reproduce. So when they reproduce, they're going to pass on the allele for long neck to their offspring. And the last part will be then the next generation will have a higher proportion of individuals with long necks. Now let's look at an example from a past paper to see how we can tackle this question. So here we have an investigative type of question. I just put the whole scenario for context purposes. It's about malaria parasite being transmitted to human blood by mosquitoes. The last question, 3.4.5, it says describe how the malaria parasite developed drug resistance through natural selection. So we are relating Darwin's theory of natural selection in this context. First thing that you need to mention is that there is a great deal of variation among the offspring. But in this case, you must be specific that it is the population of malaria parasites. Now we state the variation. So some malaria parasites are drug resistant, and some are not. So some are resistant to the antimalarial drugs, some are not resistant to it. So when there is a change in environmental conditions, in this case, the anti-malarial drug being exposed to them, those that are not resistant, they die, while those that are resistant, they survive. So now the organisms that survive will reproduce. So they survive and reproduce, keyword reproduce, and therefore they pass on the allele, which is then drug resistance, to their offspring. So it's important to specifically mention the characteristic. Then the next generation will therefore have a higher proportion of individuals that are drug resistant. Again, let's look at the mark allocation. Firstly, the first statement about variation among the malaria population, and then stating the favorable characteristic and the unfavorable characteristic. And then we also stated that those that have an unfavorable characteristic, they died, and those that have the favorable characteristic, they survive and reproduce, and then the allele is passed on from parent to the offspring. Then the last statement. Now let's have a look at the last theory, which is punctuated equilibrium by Eldridge and Gould. So punctuated equilibrium has to do with the speed at which evolution is taking place. So we'll basically look at evolution in terms of the speed. So punctuated equilibrium is a form of evolution characterized by long periods of little or no change, which alternates with short periods of rapid change. Looking at the description from the exam guidelines, the term equilibrium is when species don't change, while the term punctuated is when there are short periods of a rapid change, and this results to species forming in a short period of time. There's a term transitional fossil. These are fossils that show a transition between species. So with punctuated equilibrium, it is supported by the lack of transitional fossils, or rather the absence of. So when you look at this theory, there are two parts to it. One, which is natural selection or gradualism, where evolution is taking place over a long period of time, and then punctuated, where evolution is taking place over a short period of time. Now, this is more diagram related. So let's have a look at this diagram here. It's just time versus morphology or structures. Now to analyze this diagram, we start from the bottom going up. As time is moving, there is little or no change, and then there's short periods of change, and then long periods of little or no change, and then short periods of change. Take note that as it stems upwards, there is a new species being formed in a short period of time. So going sideways, there's a change, but going up, there is no change. Gradualism, on the other hand, we don't have these short period of change and long periods of no change. It's just gradual change throughout. Let's have a look at a past exam paper. So here the diagram below shows two models of evolution based on the rate at which it occurs, with A as well as B. Based on these straight lines at A, we can see there is punctuated equilibrium, and then it means B will be gradualism. So for 251A, letter B, and 251B will be letter A. Now the next question, you name and describe a model of evolution shown in A. The name would be punctuated equilibrium, and that's a compulsory mark. And for the description, then we describe punctuated equilibrium, which is a form of evolution that is characterized by long periods of little or no change. You can state in full that is known as equilibrium, and which alternates with short periods of rapid change, which is known as punctuated. Like I said, punctuated equilibrium is a compulsory mark, and then you mark the rest of your answer out of 2 for each 2 parts of the explanation. The next question, you name the type of fossil which supports this model. It's a transitional fossil. Let's look at a different question. So the diagram shows 2 models used to explain the theory of evolution. We have model 1 as well as model number 2. Model 1, we can see it's like gradual going up, while model 2 will be the thicker band with straight lines. So first question, identify model number 2. Definitely punctuated equilibrium due to these straight lines and long periods of the thin bands when there's no change in time. Next question, name the 2 scientists, that is Eldridge and Gould. Going to the third question, you state whether it's model 1 or 2 for these description. The first one, it shows small gradual change, definitely model 1. The next question is supported by absence of transitional fossils, and that is punctuated equilibrium model 2. Question 3, supported by a scientist who proposed theory of evolution by natural selection, and that's 1. Gradualism. Now question 154, you state what happens respectively at points A and B in model number 2. So you're specific to what's happening to the species. So we look at, are they changing or not? So they are not changing at A. We can see the straight line, and then at B there is a rapid change. So that will be 1 mark for each. Now the last question, you name the type of evolution where there is a change in characteristics of species over time. In part 1 of the series, we spoke about biological evolution. And that is the end of this video. Don't forget to subscribe. I will see you in part 3. Bye.